Today's reading is Luke 24:13 through 35. That very day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, which lay about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were discussing with each other all the various things that had taken place. As they were discussing and arguing with each other, Jesus himself approached and walked with them. Their eyes, though, were prevented from recognizing him. "You're obviously having a very important discussion on your walk," he said. "What's it all about?" They stood still, a picture of gloom. Then one of them, Cleopas by name, answered him. "You must be the only person around Jerusalem," he said, "who doesn't know what's been going on here these last few days." "What things?" he asked. "To do with Jesus of Nazareth," they said to him. "He was a prophet. He acted with power and he spoke with power before God and all the people. Our chief priests and rulers handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. But we were hoping that he was going to redeem Israel. And now, what with all this, it's the third day since it happened. But some women from our group have astonished us. They went to his tomb very early this morning and didn't find his body. They came back saying they'd seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of the folk with us went off to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they didn't see him." "You are so senseless," he said to them, "so slow in your hearts to believe all the things the prophets said to you. Don't you see? This is what had to happen. The Messiah had to suffer and then come into his glory." So he began with Moses and with all the prophets and explained to them all the things about himself throughout the whole scripture. They drew near to the village where they were heading. Jesus gave the impression that he was going further, but they urged him strongly not to. "Stay with us," they said. "It's nearly evening. The day is almost gone." And he went in to stay with them. As he was sitting at table with them, he took the bread and gave thanks. He broke it and gave it to them. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. Then they said to each other, "Do you remember how our hearts were burning inside us as he talked to us on the road, as he opened up the scripture for us?" And they got up then and there and went back to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and the people with them sheltered together. They were saying, "The Lord really has been raised. He's appeared to Simon." Then they told him what happened on the road and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread.
Jesus is made known in the breaking of the bread, just as we come to the table each week and experience him in that. I encourage all of us because we do this weekly, to not let it get too familiar and repetitive. In a lot of churches I've been in, they did it once a month or maybe once a quarter or hardly at all. But it is, for the early church, it was the centerpiece of when they came together. They came together around this table. And this table is so important, was so important then, and is now, because it was a place of leveling. Just like everybody is level at the foot of the cross, everybody is level at the table of the Lord as well. Rich or poor, young or old, no matter your race, your gender, whatever, we all come to the table the same way, and that's what is so uniting about it. And it's because Jesus lived that way. When we do that and acknowledge him in that way, we repeat or imitate him in those things, and we experience him as we do that. So this story, the Road to Emmaus story, is the remarkable conversation between the risen Jesus after his resurrection and two of his disciples. Now, these weren't two of his 12. These were two probably of his 70. Remember earlier in Luke, Jesus sends 70 out, or 71, depending on your translation. There are a couple of different Greek texts that Luke is translated from, and depending on which text your particular translation comes from, the number would be 70 or 71. So don't get all hung up on that. It's just a little discrepancy between those two texts. But these two, one is named Cleopas, the other one is not named, were probably two of the 70, the disciples that had spent time with Jesus, that spent probably a lot of time with Jesus, that Jesus had sent out into the community, and they saw miracles at their hands, and they saw how things could change, how they could actually function like Jesus in the world. So these are not just some strangers. These are some people that were familiar to Jesus, and they were familiar with Jesus. Jesus approaches them and he asks them what they're discussing. They don't recognize him at this point, which is typical of the post-resurrection appearances. But then one thing that I find so interesting about this passage is how little Jesus says in it. He approaches these two disciples of his. He observes them having this dispute. The Greek has the sense that they're arguing with one another over the events of this last weekend, the crucifixion weekend. He asks them what they're discussing, what they're arguing about, and then he listens. God listens. And if you look at this text, the longest dialogue that's recorded in the text is between these two disciples. It's not Jesus speaking. Jesus speaks quite a small amount in this passage. He asks them what they're discussing, and he listens. He doesn't act like a know-it-all. Jesus doesn't interrupt their conversation and set them right at the beginning. So to imitate Jesus, we should learn to listen too. Stu Gerard, who is one of the founding members of Delirious. Anybody remember the band Delirious? We used to sing some of their worship music. For the last 10 or 12 years, he's had a dream of putting a recording together, an album together, based on the Beatitudes, and that's just been released, and I recommend it. So Stu Gerard, Garrad, it's called Beatitudes. Actually, the song we listened to at communion, "Oh Mercy," is from that album. Stu doesn't sing at all. He's a guitar player, so there are all the songs on there are sung by other people. There is a spoken word performance on the album by a girl named Becky Harding, a Brit, and that was impactful to me. And it's called "Listen." And so yesterday I put together a lyric video of that, and let's watch that right now. It's about 3.5 minutes, and then we'll go on.
What does it mean to listen? I mean really listen, with no distractions or divisions, clear careful decisions where the outcast is first to be considered. Listening to listen, not to respond. Why is it now that listening with our eyes just does not correspond? See, when the rabbi gave the sermon, he called us to look beyond. But as humans, this seems to be a process that we love to prolong. People around us, whose presence we completely ignore, those we label as poor, or people who just can't do this anymore, or those whose society has decided are just not worth fighting for. We are called to do more. We are called to do more. We are called to do more. To no longer be silent or hidden. This is an invitation to the Beatitudes vision, to understand the message more accurately than sniper precision, to bring forth a world a misfit envisioned. Listening in harmony, dealing boldly but respectfully to hostile authority, standing up for the ones who are not the majority, offering faith, hope and love to the rest of humanity, refuting the idea that it's all about prosperity. Because if we believe that the end goal is success, then we haven't grasped the message that we are blessed. Believe me, this upside down message is not a test, because when it all goes wrong, well, he's got us even then. See, when we want certainty, he offers us presence, demonstrating love as the most powerful weapon, encouraging us as a community to step in, teaching us the wisest lesson. To lift our heads in the midst of our poverty and our brokenness, our grieving, our ache for justice and wholeness, to never lose focus. to care for others by showing mercy, to go against the grain despite the controversy, to share a message with a guarantee. No need for microphone or marquee, no iPad or hands-free, no drum roll or melodies, just a learning, listening community. Community, community, community.
We live in a time when listening is kind of a lost art. We tend to shout at each other. We tend to be so passionate about making sure people understand what we have to say that we talk over people, we shout them down. Sometimes the loudest seems to be the one that gets the most attention, the squeaky wheel getting the grease, that kind of thing. But I've called the message today, Jesus Evangelist. An evangelist is someone who brings good news. Evangelion is the Greek word. It just means the bringer of good news. So in contemporary society, we sometimes think of evangelists as people who are promoters of something, right? We have exercise evangelists, we have diet evangelists, we have political evangelists. Often evangelists are conceived of today as somebody who's trying to sell somebody else something, who's trying to promote and sell something to us. But the New Testament doesn't use the word that way. It doesn't use the word evangelist as someone who is trying to sell us something, someone who is trying to scare us into behaving a certain way. On cable television, there's a never-ending stream of self-help videos that use fear to get you to buy their product, to make you better in some way. That's not really how the New Testament uses the word evangelist. There were several post-resurrection stories in the Gospels. This is one of them. Last week we talked about the story of Thomas's doubt, and we made notice that Thomas's doubts were not that God could raise someone from the dead. He'd already seen Jesus raise 3 people from the dead. His doubts had to do with God raising a nonviolent, peace-loving, forgive everyone Messiah from the dead. It was the type of person that Jesus turned out to be that Thomas had so much trouble believing that God would honor by raising him from the dead. Jesus wasn't the Messiah that Thomas was expecting, but the resurrected Messiah was better than Thomas was expecting. It just took him a while to understand that. Rather than teaching through this story like I often do, I'd like to analyze the story from a more conceptual point of view today. To do an analysis of this encounter, not so much from a theological perspective, but more in a practical or instructional way, to see if we can find in this story a model or a framework or a template even that we can use in our lives and our interaction with people that we encounter. So rather than trying to put a lot of theological weight on this story, I'm just going to look at how it functions, how the story plays out, what Jesus does, what he doesn't do, what the disciples do and what they don't do, and think of it as a kind of an updated 4 spiritual laws. You know, if you've been in evangelical churches, you've seen those little pamphlets of 4 spiritual laws, which was a method to do evangelism, right? And it picked verses mostly from the epistles of Paul to convince people that they needed salvation. And while that has been effective and has been fruitful in some ways, I think it's kind of a tired method now, and it doesn't really present Jesus, I think, the way Jesus presents himself. So I'm more concerned with modeling or imitating Jesus and the way he presents himself. So this post-resurrection story is very interesting to me as a template for how we might involve ourselves in the lives of people that we encounter as well. So I find I'll highlight 6 different points that we might consider today, and then in discussion we can talk about those points. So the point one was what I've called be observant. Let me read the beginning of the story again. That very day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, which lay about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were discussing with each other all the various things that had taken place. As they were discussing and arguing with one another, Jesus himself approached and walked with them. So Jesus noticed that these two disciples were arguing and wrestling, trying to understand something that had just happened in their lives, the crucifixion of him, actually. Can we be observant like this when we're around other people? Make note of when we see people wrestling with something or trying to make sense of something. We can live our lives in a very self-absorbed way. I'm very guilty of this because I'm not naturally an extrovert. I'm not naturally somebody that goes out easily and talks to people. And from a kid, I was never that way. My younger brother was, and I think I've said before, because it was a different time when I grew up in Dover. My mother would go into a store and leave both my brother and I in the car with the windows down, and not think about it. You wouldn't do that with your kids now. But my brother would be hanging out the windows talking to everybody that was walking by, and I'd be yanking him back in. Stop it, Roger. Because he was extroverted and I was introverted. I couldn't dream of doing that, of being outgoing and engaging somebody just as they're walking by. But in this story, we see that Jesus was observant. He made note of the problem these two disciples were having. He sees what they're discussing, trying to make sense of this. So point number one is be observant. Point number two, and we can think of it again, I'm using this like a template for us to implement, and this isn't the only way. This is just one thing that we can consider. So the second thing is be inquisitive. In verse 16, their eyes, though, were prevented from recognizing him. You're obviously having a very important discussion on your walk, he said. What's it all about? So Jesus was observant. He saw that they were having this difficult discussion. And he comes alongside them and just inquires about the discussion that they're having. Now, it's likely that Jesus knew exactly what the discussion was that they were having. But he asked them anyway. He enters the conversation by asking them what they're talking about. And it's really important, I think, that he doesn't identify himself right off the top. He doesn't say, hey guys, I'm Jesus. I've been raised from the dead. He doesn't say, I have the answer to what you're struggling with. He doesn't say, I know what you guys are talking about. He doesn't say, the Bible has the answer to every question that you might have. He doesn't say, I'm a Christian and I know the answer to your problems. These are just things that I've seen Christians do right off the top of conversations that I think can be a hindrance. So Jesus is observant and he's inquisitive. He joins the conversation, but he doesn't hijack the conversation. He joins it by just asking a question. What are you guys talking about? Be inquisitive. Number 3, be a good listener. Then one of them, Cleopas by name, answered him, you must be the only person around Jerusalem, he said, who doesn't know what's been going on here these last few days. What things? So Jesus, in listening, he just intersperses something to encourage them to continue to tell him. What things? What things, he asked. To do with Jesus of Nazareth, they said to him. He was a prophet. He acted with power, and he spoke with power before God and all the people. Our chief priests and rulers handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. But we were hoping that he was going to redeem Israel. And now, what with all this, it's the 3rd day since it happened. But some women from our group have astonished us. They went to his tomb very early this morning, and they didn't find his body. They came back saying they'd seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of the folk with us went off to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they didn't see him. So Jesus listens intently to their story and even prompts them to tell him more. Partway through the story, he says, what things? Even though he knew the things that they were talking about. Only one of them is given a name, Cleopas. The other one is not. That whenever that happens, that's an invitation for us to put ourselves in that character. Put ourselves, Cleopas and Kirk, Cleopas and Dale. We can put ourselves into the story. He doesn't jump in at any point here to correct them. He lets them tell their story. He listens. He shows them that he values their thoughts and that he's empathetic to their situation. I think it's actually necessary that we give people time to express what they're thinking and going through. There is part of the process of coming to terms with something that you don't understand is being able to talk through it, is to be able to express yourself and to get it out. And that's what Jesus is allowing them to do here. He doesn't jump in, he doesn't hijack the conversation and assume that he knows the answer to what their problem is. So first, he was observant. Second, he was inquisitive. Third, he was a good listener. We can be all of those as well. Fourth, he offers an alternative understanding. He says, "You are so senseless," he said to them. Some translations say, "Oh, you foolish ones. So slow in your hearts to believe all the things that the prophets said to you. Don't you see? This is what had to happen. The Messiah had to suffer and then come into his glory. So he began with Moses and with all the prophets and explained to them the things about himself throughout the whole of Scripture." Now remember that these are disciples of Jesus. They're friends of Jesus. So you could take that, the way Jesus jumps into the conversation here, saying, "You foolish ones," or "You are so senseless," as a little harsh. But remember, these are people that he knows, that spent probably several years with him, that had heard him explain all of this before, but completely lost it. He had actually explained to them that he had to go to the cross. He had said on numerous occasions he would be killed, he would be arrested by the religious and the political leaders, and that they would take him to his death, but on the third day he would be raised from the dead. So this was not news to them. But they had so minimized it in their thinking that they were just lost in confusion now. So I think that's the spirit we can understand Jesus here in. He's not being cruel. He's just saying, "You guys, we've been around this barn a few times before, and you're not getting it." These are friends of his. But only after Jesus listened long enough for them to express the dilemma that they were in does Jesus speak. He allows them to completely express the quandary they're in, the dilemma that they're having. And then he doesn't say, "Oh, you guys are wrong," but he offers them an alternative way to think about the situation. Because actually nothing that they had said when they told their story was wrong. It was all accurate, but they were just interpreting it from a different angle, right? So in this case, he uses Scripture because their dilemma had to do with Scripture. And he reinterprets Scriptures as beginning with Moses. This is what we've been doing here at Meeting Place for over 2 years now. We've been learning to reinterpret Scripture through the risen Jesus, through the crucified and risen Jesus. It's exciting. But this is where Jesus begins to teach his disciples how to do this. He doesn't tell them that they're wrong. He just gives them a better way to understand the story that they weren't able to make sense of. He reframes, in other words, the events that they were so confused about. He does appeal to Scripture, but for us, we won't always, or maybe even often, have to appeal to Scripture. Remember, when Jesus taught parables, almost never in the parables does he appeal to Scripture. He tells stories that involve them and teach them something at a deeper level without an appeal to Scripture. In this case, he did appeal to Scripture because they were wrestling with this idea that their Scriptures told them the Messiah would come, but the idea of who the Messiah was going to look like was what they had wrong. So we know enough about Jesus now, I'm speaking to us here, that we can take Jesus with us to interpret events that people are encountering in their lives without whipping out our gospel gun and blasting them with Scriptures all the time. Now, there may be a case where that will work, and that'll be necessary, and that'll be effective. But just be aware that it's not always the approach to take. So Jesus was observant, inquisitive, he was a good listener, and then he speaks and gives them a different way to understand the events that they were just wrestling with, an alternative way to understand them. And number 5, he assesses their interest. So after he gives them another way to think about the story, he doesn't just go on and telling them more and more and more stuff. He actually assesses their interest. In verse 28, it says, they drew near to the village where they were heading. Jesus gave the impression that he was going further, but they urged him strongly not to. Stay with us, they said. It's nearly evening. The day is almost gone, and he went in to stay with them. So Jesus doesn't impose himself on these guys. He gives them an alternate way to understand what they've been dealing with, and then he basically excuses himself. What does that do? It gives them an opportunity to allow him to leave or to ask him to stay longer. So Jesus is not, it's not like the TV evangelists that we see that sense at this point that they've almost got the deal closed. And if they just hammer a little bit more on hell or something, then we can get them to make a decision. Jesus isn't that way at all. He actually appears that he's going to leave them after just encountering them and giving them an alternate way to understand what they've been going through. He begins to leave. He doesn't overstay his welcome. It's always better to leave them wanting more than overstaying your welcome. I learned that as a musician. You know, you can do a half-hour set or 40-minute set. When you do an hour set, you see people getting tired. Actually, as a worship leader, I would try to always be cognizant of this, because you can lose the congregation. You know, you can do a few songs, and if you're looking around and you see, oh, the only people that are worshiping anymore are the worship team. Well, you've kind of lost you've gone too far at that point. You know, so you can rail on the congregation to get them back into worship, but that's not what Jesus did here. He assessed their interest. He was aware of their, is this working? Are they receptive to what I'm telling them? Are they open to hear more or not? And rather than asking that, he just appears like he's going to leave. And then they ask him to stay. They were finding value in what he was telling them. And then finally, number 6, he makes himself known. Starting at verse 30, as he was sitting at table with them, he took the bread and gave thanks. He broke it and gave it to them. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. Then they said to each other, do you remember how our hearts were burning inside us as he talked to us on the road, as he opened up the Bible, the scripture for us? So Jesus made himself known to them in the bread. This is why we come to the table each Sunday, to encounter the God who makes himself known to us in the bread. The Lord's table is open to all who want him. It's an invitation to everyone. The Lord's table is where all our differences mean nothing. The Lord's table is where all are equal, all are loved, all are welcome. This is what we affirm each week as we come to the table. So only after observing that these two were struggling to understand recent events, and only after inquiring in a gentle, non-threatening way about what they were talking to, and only after listening attentively and respectfully, and only after offering an alternative way to understand what had happened, and only after assessing whether they were interested and accepting their invitation to come to the home with them, only after all of that did Jesus make himself known to them. So, as I read this story this way, my question is, can this be a model for how we might engage people today in our circumstances, in our lives? Can this be, and it's not to be the only one, because actually over the next couple of weeks we'll talk about some different methods. But I think we've been here for a little over 2 years now at Meeting Place, and we've learned a lot of stuff. And I think we shouldn't be stingy with it. I don't think we should hoard it. But there's a right way and there's a wrong way. There's a way that people will be receptive to what we have to say. There's another way that they won't be receptive to what we have to say. And because the church has alienated so many people, the church at large, over the last 60 years or so, people are hip to a lot of evangelistic methods, and they just shut them off. That's what I find so valuable about this story, is that Jesus doesn't even identify himself until the very end. Think about it this way. If you had to think of yourself in a conversation like this with somebody, why would you want to bring God into the conversation before you knew whether the person you were talking to was finding anything of value in what you had to say? You know what I mean? Because if they're not finding it of value, why would you credit that to God? It actually diminishes God's character when we do that. So when we come roaring in saying, "Oh, I'm a Christian, I've got the answer to this. The Bible knows all this stuff, and I can sort this out for you." And then when you try to sort it out for them, if it doesn't make sense to them, and if they don't want to ask you more, and if it's not connecting with them, you've already told them that this is what God thinks about their circumstance. It seems to be in this story that there's great wisdom in this, that Jesus himself, who is God, doesn't even make himself known as God until the last part of the story. We can inadvertently cause God's reputation to be minimized if we're not careful. Now, this is not to say that there's never a time for us to speak forthrightly as a Christian in the world. I'm not saying this is the only way we ought to consider speaking with people. And in next week and maybe the week after, we'll talk about an alternative way when the door opens for that. But just to be sensitive to circumstances and to the way people think about God and Christianity today, I think this is one way we could think about it. So what do you guys think about this as kind of a template for how we might encounter people in our worlds and our lives today?